Starfield is Bethesda's latest entry in their lineup of RPGs and their first new IP in 25 years. The stake is high for this title, and many people are ready to delve into a completely new universe from Bethesda. But how does it play? Does it live up to expectations? And is it any good? For all the answers, continue to watch this video. Welcome to Play Review Spot's review of Starfield.
You're part of Constellation now. Part of our family.
Bethesda's new IP introduces us to the Milky Way galaxy on a great scale. In this universe, humanity has reached for the stars as humanity's planet has met its demise. Human colonies have spread throughout the galaxies and formed different alliances, the biggest of them being the United Colonies, shortened to the UC. But they are not alone, as Starfield introduces us to plentiful of different cities and factions, like the Free Star Collective, which simply put are space cowboys, and the Crimson Fleet, which also simply put are space pirates. Along with other factions like House Varun, Spacers, and Ecliptic, you are sure to meet all kinds of different factions with different cultures and interests, and some are friendlier than others. The world building of Starfield is good, and arguably more believable than older series, like Fallout, and it really works in Bethesda's favor. The NASA punk theme feels believable, yet futuristic, and gives plenty of room for the player to explore and delve into interesting lore in this galaxy. The biggest selling point for Starfield was probably the ability to explore 1,000 planets, and while that on paper sounds exciting, in practice, it really was the content that was the least enticing to delve into. You see, each planet is procedurally generated from the point of landing on them, and while that sounds good enough, there simply isn't enough handcrafted content to support it, at least not for a long time. It didn't really take many planets before reused assets of the same cave or outpost was used, and with no real variation to them. And so, while I did play around with it a bit, it really wasn't particularly fun after a couple of hours. And so, if you think you will get an unlimited amount of fun exploring planets, I'm sorry to disappoint you. That doesn't mean, however, that some elements of it were enjoyable. Exploring planets was interesting at the beginning of the game, but it just wasn't really all it was hyped up to be. It still serves, however, as a good atmospheric element in making you feel like you truly are exploring the universe, and that is a feeling Starfield has captured. The graphics of Starfield are a mixed bag. Creation Engine 2, sure, is a definite upgrade from its older counterpart, but Starfield is not a graphical innovation. The game looks fine in many places, but downright ugly at other times, and that is especially apparent in areas where you get closer to objects and you see the textures clearer. The game, however, does look within the expectations I had for the game, but it sure isn't a marble to look at.
We're all here because we're committed to the biggest question of all. What's out there?
Talking about exploring the universe also sets up the main story of the game. As the protagonist, you are hired as a miner in a mining company, as you stumble over an interesting artifact deep inside the planet. Upon touching it, you experience a vision and pass out. Upon waking up, you are told about the artifact's meaning for a group of explorers called the Constellation, which welcomes you with open arms in the search for more of these artifacts. The premise for the story is quite interesting, but the pacing of the story is somewhat off. Not only is the game quite slow in the start, but furthermore, the game gives you quite literally only variations of the same quest in the main story for a long time. At least half of the quests in the main story is collecting these artifacts, which is fine, but all these variations of these artifact capturing quests are also concentrated at the start of the game. In one way, I don't really mind a steady objective to work towards, but the game is kind of slow on the trigger to actually explain what these artifacts are, and it can make the beginning of the story feel quite unengaging and dull. In the game's defense, the story does pick up its paces, and eventually comes to quite an interesting revelation. I would just wish there were more interesting events and foreshadowing building up earlier in the story. And this leads us very neatly into the companions in the game. In Starfield, the companions that you can have are the team of Constellation: Sarah Morgan, Barrett, Sam Coe, Vasco, and Andresha. Compared to earlier Bethesda titles, these companions have a lot more meat on their bones. Each companion has a surprising amount of dialogue about their interests, backstory, and current developments. Most of these companions also have interesting side quests connected to them to allow you to get to know them even better. Furthermore, each companion can chime in on conversations you have to give their opinion on something. These companions are with no doubt Bethesda's strongest and deepest, but they are also maybe the most monotone. The biggest problem with these companions is that they are morally very one-sided, except for Vasco, who really don't care what you do. But for the others, they don't really allow you to roleplay a more morally gray character without upsetting them. Of course, the game also allows you to recruit other crew members who probably don't care too much about your morally hideous actions, but it would be nice to have some companions who were more rebellious and morally bad with more flesh on them.
We do not fully understand all that is at work here.
No finer group in the stars to be unraveling this mystery.
There are plenty of interesting quests and activities beyond the main story in Starfield. The game allows you to play quests for the three most present factions in the game: the UC, the Crimson Fleet, and the Freestar Collective. Each of them has interesting storylines and characters connected to them, and I found myself often being more invested in these stories than the main story. Apart from that, there are plenty of quests and activities to be found in the different main cities, and a good amount to be found exploring the different universes. All in all, there are plenty of side quests and activities of varying quality throughout the galaxy to explore, and you can definitely expect to spend several dozen hours doing them. Two known elements of Bethesda titles are lockpicking and dialogue, and each of these systems has been refined and improved upon. The lockpicking minigame has been changed to a pin system, where the goal is to use the correct pins in the correct holes. It is a simple system that I find to not necessarily to be harder, but it feels more like I'm actually using my brain, and therefore skills, to solve them. Dialogue has also been greatly improved with a noticeably greater amount of dialogue options, as well as a new persuasion system. Both of these are great changes from previous titles.
That doesn't sound like Commander Natara.
The combat of Starfield is noticeably better than previous Bethesda titles, and the help Bethesda got from ID Software shows in how Starfield's combat is more fluent, tighter, and responsive than any Bethesda titles have been before. That does, however, not really say much by itself, as the game still feels a bit stiff compared to modern shooters. It is a combat system that feels okay and serviceable. The enemy's range and difficulty isn't always very clear on how hard a battle will be, especially in the early game. However, as you level up, the game becomes increasingly easier, and at level 50 with my character, I really never struggled anymore in a firefight. The game gives plenty of options in weapons and abilities, and it almost feels like the scaling just isn't happening fast enough. Overall, Starfield's combat is serviceable and enjoyable, but probably on the easier side for those who wish for a real challenge on harder difficulties.
These artifacts could be everything we've been looking for. Another great secret the universe is asking us to unravel.
Quest structure has not really progressed since older titles, and the structure of finding NPCs, talking to them, being sent somewhere, doing their request, and returning is still the norm here in Bethesda. I don't fault this system, but you would think that the use of radio or other kinds of communications would also be present in Starfield's technological universe. Cyberpunk experimented with this system, where quests were given through messages and phone calls, and while that system wasn't perfect, it definitely felt more immersive and lifelike. Starfield is good old Bethesda when it comes to quests, and it carries the same flaws as its predecessors. big aspect of Starfield that I did quite enjoy, though, was its shipbuilding system. In Starfield, your ship is your biggest friend, and the game allows you to capture, sell, and even build your own ships. The system works very well, with surprisingly few limitations when it comes to creativity. I really thought that it was a bit gimmicky at the start, but the shipbuilding quickly became one of my favorite activities in the game. With the game's focus on roleplay, there is also no set meta for ships, and the ability to create ships based on needs is refreshing. I quickly built myself a combat ship, but also saw the interest in building cargo ships and long-distance grav-jump ships. When it comes to actually using these ships, the game gives you plenty of action in dogfights, high-orbit battles among the stars. The combat system is good and arcade-focused, but they become more increasingly challenging as you stumble across higher-end ships. Flying and actually traversing with the ships are non-existent, however, as each phase, landing, orbit, or traveling between different planets and systems are hidden between loading screens and instanced hubs. And while I didn't really get bothered by it at the start, the flaw of being so reliant on fast traveling in a game about exploration becomes apparent in the lack of enjoyable and rewarding exploration. The fast traveling really made me feel like the action and narrative never had a break, and I found it actually very enjoyable at the start. However, this sinking feeling of missing out on all the random encounters, interesting events, and side quests that you experienced in Fallout, and the Elder Scrolls settled in slowly. The game always keeps you running from one quest to another, and there are generally very little to no rewards for simply landing on a planet and exploring. There are a few outposts and areas of interest, but after a few runs on different planets, it becomes obvious how frequently Bethesda reused older locations and assets. Which in itself is fine, the planet's surface is procedurally generated after all, but the lack of variation and content that follows it simply isn't enough to keep exploring off the beaten path worth it. The Outpost system is pretty robust actually, and there is plenty of content here for those who enjoy building working and automated systems. In many ways, the Outpost system feels a lot more at home in Starfield than the settlement system in Fallout 4. However, I can't scratch the feeling that not having a settlement building system in Starfield is a missed opportunity. I mean, building civilized settlements on new and foreign planets sounds like fun, and the ability to create economic and working hub systems would have been a great addition to Starfield. However, the system that is present is fine, and makes it possible to gather resources and create quite impressive outposts. I never really spent many hours in the outpost system myself, but it didn't take a long time before I realized how quickly the outpost system could be misused to gather a ridiculous number of resources and experience points. The leveling system in Starfield is simple, but very functional. Each skill is divided into categories, and each of these categories requires a certain amount of points used in that category before the more advanced skills become available to purchase. The skill tree is also large and meaningful enough that a master of all traits character is not really possible. And I found that to be enjoyable, as I actually had to think about where and when I used my skill points. The game is very much built with New Game Plus in its thoughts. And while I found the system to be cool the first time I finished the game, I also found the lack of actual diversification and consequences to be lackluster. And while some people will tell you to rush to a New Game Plus, my recommendation is to just play the game as you would with any other game, as the rewards for rushing it simply aren't worth it.
End of this road will change humanity forever.
To conclude, Starfield is the biggest leap for Bethesda, but at the same time, it simply reminds me more of a small skip forward. I personally enjoyed the game, but the more I played, the more the cracks became clearer. And while I would argue that Starfield is Bethesda's best game, Starfield simply is a victim of Bethesda not willing to go outside their comfort zone and actually do something new. I mean, most of Starfield feels like Bethesda's older titles, and it really feels like every decision about Starfield's game design boils down to the comfort of delivering something that they already have done. And so Starfield is a title that you most likely will enjoy if you enjoy games that Bethesda has released prior, I just can't really say that Starfield was the revolution I had hoped Bethesda was willing to go for. This review was presented to you by Play Review Spot. Subscribe to stay up to date on news, reviews, and more gaming-related content. Be also sure to hit that like button if you enjoyed this video.